At 33 years old, Josephine Hale stood outside the assay office in Silver Creek, Colorado, holding a telegram that confirmed what she already knew in her bones. Her husband, Daniel, 3 months gone prospecting in the high country, was never coming home. His body found at the bottom of a collapsed shaft nobody had bothered to timber properly. She had $6, a wedding ring she would not sell, and a landlord who had already begun eyeing her room for the next paying tenant. When she heard that the old bathhouse at the edge of town, shuttered for 2 years and avoided by every miner who passed it after dark, was going for $4 because nobody would touch it, she paid the price without hesitation. That old bathhouse is cursed, the miners warned her, crossing themselves or spitting in the dust depending on their persuasion, insisting that something had happened there that no decent soul should disturb. Josephine did not believe in curses, but behind the great copper bathing tub bolted to the back room's floor, she would find something that silenced every miner who had ever laughed at her, and gave an entire mountain town back something it had lost without ever knowing it was gone. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Hale. If you've ever bought into something everyone else was too afraid to touch. We hope you'll tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Josephine had been born Josephine Reyes in 1858 in a modest adobe house on the outskirts of Santa Fe, the only daughter of a woman named Concepcion Reyes, who ran a small but well-regarded bathhouse and laundry serving the town's more prosperous households, a business Concepcion had inherited from her own mother and expanded through decades of careful, unglamorous labor. It was Concepcion who taught Josephine, from the time she was old enough to carry a bucket without spilling it, the particular discipline of the bathhouse trade, how water had to be heated to precisely the right temperature before a guest would tolerate it, how certain minerals in the local springs left residues that had to be scrubbed with specific mixtures of ash and tallow soap, how the great copper tubs themselves required regular maintenance, their joints checked and resoldered before rust could compromise them, because a leaking tub in a business built on water was a failure no amount of charm could paper over. A bathhouse is just made physical, Concepcion used to tell her daughter, working a rag along the curved inner wall of a tub until it gleamed. Because a person comes to you in the most vulnerable state there is, undressed and exhausted, and you owe them cleanliness and warmth and privacy in exchange for that trust. You fail at any one of those 3 things, you've failed at all of it. Josephine absorbed this lesson the way children absorb their parents' deepest working philosophies, without fully grasping its weight until many years later, when the trade her mother taught her would prove far more valuable than either of them could have imagined in that modest Santa Fe washroom. Concepcion also taught her daughter to read the ledgers that tracked the bathhouse's modest but steady income, insisting that Josephine understand every figure before she was 15. Because a woman who runs her own business, Concepcion said, cannot afford to let anyone else tell her what her own numbers mean. Josephine's father had left the family when she was young, a fact Concepcion spoke of rarely and without visible bitterness, simply absorbing the loss into the steady rhythm of the bathhouse's operation, the way she absorbed every other hardship life presented her. Josephine grew up then in a household run entirely by women, learning early that competence and independence were not qualities reserved for men, whatever the wider territory around her might have suggested otherwise. She met Daniel Hale in 1878, a young mining engineer passing through Santa Fe on his way to a surveying job in the Colorado high country. A gentle, curious man who spent 3 evenings at Concepcion's bathhouse in genuine, unhurried conversation with Josephine about mineral compositions and water chemistry, subjects he found she understood with a precision that delighted rather than intimidated him. They married within the year, and Josephine left Santa Fe for the mining boomtown of Silver Creek, Colorado, a settlement of perhaps 1,200 souls carved into a steep mountain valley. its economy entirely dependent on the silver veins running through the surrounding peaks and the fortunes, good and bad, of the men who dug for them. Daniel worked as a mining engineer for the Comstock and Bell Company, one of Silver Creek's two dominant mining concerns, earning a respectable if unspectacular wage that allowed the couple a small rented house near the edge of town and, in time, the beginnings of savings toward a home of their own. Josephine, missing the bathhouse trade she had grown up within and finding herself with more idle hours than her nature comfortably tolerated, took in laundry and occasional bathing services for a handful of Silver Creek families. Never enough to constitute a proper business, but enough to keep her hands busy and her mother's careful lessons from going entirely to waste. They had no children in their 5 years of marriage, a private sorrow they carried together with the same quiet, undramatic resilience that characterized most of their partnership, finding in each other's company a sufficiency that did not require completion by anything else. Silver Creek itself, in the years of Josephine's residence there, was a town balanced precariously between prosperity and ruin, its fortunes tied entirely to the silver veins, the Comstock and Bell Company, and its smaller rival, the Truscott mining concern, extracted from the surrounding mountains. The town had once supported a proper bathhouse of its own, a substantial building at the eastern edge of town constructed in the boom years of the early 1870s by a proprietor named Emmett Younger, a former miner who had built the operation into something the whole valley took a certain pride in, a rare touch of civilized comfort in a rough mountain settlement where most men went weeks between proper washes. But in the spring of 1881, some 2 years before Josephine's own arrival in Silver Creek, the bathhouse had closed abruptly and permanently, its proprietor Emmett Younger having vanished from town in circumstances nobody could ever fully explain, leaving behind rumors that had calcified over 2 years of retelling into something considerably more sinister than whatever plain facts might have originally accounted for his disappearance. Daniel Hale died in the autumn of 1883, 5 years into their marriage, when a mining shaft he had personally flagged as inadequately timbered collapsed anyway during a routine inspection, the Comstock and Bell Company's foreman having overruled Daniel's warnings in the interest of maintaining the extraction schedule, a decision that cost Daniel his life and left the company facing no formal consequence beyond a brief, perfunctory inquiry that concluded, predictably, that the collapse had been an unavoidable accident of mining rather than a foreseeable failure someone had chosen to ignore. Josephine received the telegram confirming her husband's death on a gray October morning, and in the weeks that followed, she discovered exactly how precarious her position as a mining engineer's widow truly was. The Comstock and Bell Company owed her nothing beyond Daniel's final wages, already spent on burial costs, and their modest rented house, it emerged, had been held in Daniel's name alone, its lease transferring automatically to a new tenant the moment his death was confirmed. Josephine spent that autumn watching her circumstances narrow with the particular relentlessness of grief compounded by financial precarity, taking in what laundry work she could find while her landlord grew visibly impatient for her room, until, by early November, she found herself with $6 to her name, a wedding ring she would not part with under any circumstance, and genuinely no clear path forward in a mining town where a widow with no male protector and no formal trade, beyond informal laundry work, commanded little respect and fewer opportunities. It was in this narrowed circumstance that she heard, from a sympathetic neighbor woman, that the county was finally disposing of the old Younger bathhouse at the eastern edge of town, its taxes long delinquent, its condition after 2 years of abandonment presumed poor, and its reputation, thanks to 2 years of accumulated rumor about Emmett Younger's disappearance, thoroughly cursed in the estimation of every superstitious miner in Silver Creek. Asterisk. The sale, held on a cold morning at the county recorder's modest office, drew almost no interest beyond Josephine herself, and two men present mainly to observe rather than bid. And when she offered $4, the recorder accepted with visible relief at finally clearing the delinquent parcel from his books, though not before warning her, in the same breath as the transaction's completion, that she oughtn't expect much of a welcome from the town's miners, who had developed, in the 2 years since Younger's disappearance, a genuine and widely shared unwillingness to go anywhere near the building after dark. Word of her purchase spread through Silver Creek within a day, and Josephine found herself the recipient of unsolicited warnings from a dozen different quarters, miners who insisted, with the particular certainty of men repeating a story they'd told each other so many times it had become indistinguishable from memory, that Emmett Younger had vanished under circumstances involving something buried or hidden within the bathhouse itself, that strange sounds had been heard from the building on windless nights, that the whole structure carried a curse no sensible person ought to disturb. Josephine, who had grown up in her mother's bathhouse hearing every variety of superstition Santa Fe's clientele cared to share about water, steam, and the vulnerable business of undressing before strangers, found the warnings more tiresome than frightening. She walked out to the old Younger bathhouse that same afternoon, and found a building in considerably better condition than 2 years of rumor and neglect might have suggested. A solid timber structure with a stone foundation, clearly built by someone who understood the trade. Its bathing room dominated by an enormous copper tub, considerably larger and finer than anything her mother had ever owned in Santa Fe, bolted securely to the floor and connected to a still functional system of pipes that had once drawn water from a nearby spring and heated it through a firebox built into the room's rear wall. Dust lay thick over everything, and a family of mice had clearly claimed the changing room as their own territory. But the bathhouse's fundamental infrastructure, Josephine noted with the same assessing eye her mother had trained into her decades before, remained essentially sound. It was on her 3rd day of clearing the building, scrubbing accumulated grime from the great copper tub in preparation for eventually reopening the operation, that Josephine noticed something her mother's training made her uniquely positioned to catch: the tub's rear panel. The section facing the wall, and normally invisible to anyone using the bath in the ordinary course of business, had been resealed with solder noticeably fresher and less weathered than the tub's original joints. A repair job competent enough to pass casual inspection, but subtly inconsistent to a trained eye with the tub's otherwise uniform age. Her heart moving strangely in her chest, Josephine spent the better part of an afternoon carefully working the newer solder, loose with a heated iron salvaged from the bathhouse's own firebox. And when the panel finally came free, she found, tucked into a shallow compartment built into the tub's rear housing, a leather satchel wrapped in oilcloth, containing a modest but genuine cache of silver coin, alongside a bundle of letters and a ledger bearing Emmett Younger's own careful hand. The ledger and letters, read over the following days by lamplight in the bathhouse's small back office, told a story considerably different from the curse Silver Creek's miners had constructed around Emmett Younger's disappearance. Younger, it emerged, had built his bathhouse into more than a simple commercial operation. Over the decade of its successful running, he had used it, the ledger's careful entries revealed, as a place where injured or destitute miners, men the Comstock and Bell Company and the Truscott concern alike discarded the moment an accident left them unable to work, could receive free bathing, basic wound care, and, in the more troubling entries, quiet cash assistance drawn from Younger's own profits to help such men and their families survive until they found other work, or, in the saddest cases the ledger documented, simply to see them through their final weeks with some measure of dignity and cleanliness. Younger's letters, several addressed to a Denver attorney whose name Josephine did not recognize, revealed the deeper mystery. He had spent years quietly documenting a pattern of company negligence in mine safety, correlating specific accidents against specific instances where company foremen had overruled engineers' safety recommendations to maintain extraction schedules. Precisely the pattern that had cost Josephine her own husband, and had been building at the time of his disappearance, toward a formal legal complaint intended to force both mining companies into safety reforms. The Territorial Mining Code technically required but rarely enforced. The deepening mystery. As Josephine pieced together over the following weeks with the same careful, methodical attention her mother had modeled across a lifetime running her own establishment, was this Emmett Younger's final letter, dated just days before his disappearance in the spring of 1881, indicated he had finally secured a sympathetic hearing with a territorial mining inspector willing to review his documented pattern of negligence, a hearing that, had it proceeded, would have exposed both the Comstock and Bell Company and the Truscott concern to significant liability and forced safety reforms that would have cost both companies considerably in reduced extraction speed. Younger never made that hearing. His disappearance, Josephine now understood with growing unease, had occurred at precisely the moment his evidence became dangerous to interests considerably more powerful than a single bathhouse proprietor. And the curse that had kept Silver Creek's miners away from his building for 2 years had served, however unintentionally, the very useful function of keeping anyone from looking closely enough to find what Younger had hidden and what his disappearance had actually meant. Josephine, working with a sympathetic young Silver Creek attorney named Walter Combs, who had coincidentally been the very Denver correspondent Younger's letters referenced before Combs relocated his practice to Silver Creek itself, began the careful work of verifying Younger's documented pattern against the Territorial Mining Commission's own incomplete but still accessible accident records, finding, over weeks of painstaking cross-reference, that the pattern held a statistically improbable concentration of preventable accidents, Daniel's own death among them, clustered specifically around instances where company foremen had overruled documented engineering warnings. Asterisk. The conflict arrived the moment word of Josephine's inquiries reached Elias Truscott himself, principal owner of the Truscott mining concern, and Josephine learned with growing alarm. The same man whose company records appeared most heavily implicated in Younger's documented pattern of negligence. Truscott, a stout, silver-bearded man accustomed to Silver Creek, deferring entirely to his commercial judgment, arrived at the Bathhouse one November afternoon with an offer dressed as neighborly concern, proposing to purchase the property from Josephine at a price considerably above her $4, citing worry for a widow alone running a business with such an unfortunate history. Though his manner carried an unmistakable undertone, Josephine recognized immediately from her mother's own decades of reading difficult clientele. When Josephine declined, gently but without hesitation, Truscott's friendliness cooled into something closer to threat, and within days the whispers that had always surrounded the Bathhouse acquired a new, sharper edge. No longer vague superstition about Younger's vanishing, but pointed suggestions that the widow Hale was clearly unstable, digging through a dead man's belongings, disturbing things better left buried. When whispers failed to move her, someone attempted, one cold night, to set fire to the Bathhouse's woodpile, a clumsy act of intimidation that Josephine, sleeping lightly in the small back room she'd claimed as living quarters, managed to extinguish before it spread beyond the pile itself. It was that attempted fire, witnessed by a passing night watchman who happened to be a cousin of one of the miners, Younger's ledger documented having helped years before, that began turning Silver Creek sentiment. The watchman, a quiet man named Amos Prout, began asking questions of his own and found, among the older miners who remembered Younger fondly rather than fearfully, several who confirmed privately what Josephine's ledger already suggested, that Younger had indeed helped injured men quietly for years, that his sudden disappearance had never sat right with those who knew him best, and that Elias Truscott's company had, in fact, employed the very foreman most frequently named in Younger's documented pattern of overruled safety warnings. The climax came on a bright, cold morning in December when Josephine, with Walter Combs's careful legal guidance and Amos Brute's quietly gathered testimony from a half-dozen miners willing at last to speak, brought the full documented pattern before the territorial mining inspector Younger's own final letter had named. A man still serving in that capacity, and startled to learn that the complaint he'd once agreed to hear had apparently been silenced by its author's disappearance rather than abandoned by choice. The inspector's formal review, conducted over the following weeks with a thoroughness Elias Truscott could not obstruct without drawing precisely the scrutiny he most wished to avoid, confirmed the pattern definitively, resulting in mandated safety reforms across both the Truscott concern and the Comstock and Bell Company. Reforms that would, in the years following, measurably reduce the accident rate in Silver Creek's mines, though they came too late for Daniel Hull, for Emmett Younger, and for every miner whose name Younger's careful ledger had recorded in its saddest final entries. Truscott himself faced no criminal charge, evidence of his direct role in Younger's actual disappearance proving impossible to establish conclusively after 2 years. But the mandated reforms cost his company considerably in reduced extraction speed, and the town's regard for him, once nearly unquestioning, curdled permanently into the same wary distance Silver Creek had once reserved for the Bathhouse itself. Josephine used Younger's recovered silver, as he had clearly always intended some worthy use for it, to formally reopen the Bathhouse as both a working business and, in quiet continuation of Younger's own practice, a place where injured miners could receive free basic care, funding this second function through the Bathhouse's now thriving commercial trade. Silver Creek's miners returning in droves once the true, unglamorous, entirely uncursed truth of Younger's disappearance became known, and so we return, as we always do, to where we began, to a woman of 33, warned away from a bathhouse the whole town called cursed, buying it anyway with the last $4 to her name. Josephine Hale did not buy that bathhouse because she disbelieved in curses out of simple stubbornness. She bought it because her mother had taught her that a bathhouse is trust made physical, and trust, once properly understood, has very little room left over for superstition. What she found behind that copper tub was never simply silver. It was one man's quiet, dangerous kindness, silenced before it could finish its work. And it took a widow the town had also written off to finish, at last, what his disappearance had left undone. Thank you for spending this time with Josephine's story, and with Silver Creek's. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs reminding tonight that the things a community fears most are sometimes simply the truths it hasn't yet found the courage to face. We would love to know, is there a time in your life when looking past what everyone else feared revealed something worth far more than the fear itself? Tell us about it below. We read every story you leave us, and we are always glad to hear them. Until next time, stay close, *.